Welcome to the Audiation in the Wild podcast with your hosts, Bo Talifer and Eric Rasmussen. Episode 1, Introduction to Audiation in the Wild. So, Bo, what are we doing here?
That's a pretty good question.
We've been talking for how many hours? 50? More?
Oh, there's no way it's less. There's no way it's less than 50 because the first time I ever met you, we talked for 3 hours.
And yeah, that's the first time we met was 3 hours. It was like soulmate in terms of taking how music is learned and applying it to the real world, not just our tribe, and finding out from other tribe members who don't know they're part of our tribe that live outside of, music learning theory, capital MLT, or that live in the wild. We decided, or we thought about this. One of the conversations we had is, what are we going to name this sucker? Call it Audiation in the Wild.
Which was fun because that was a phrase that I kept using and I didn't even really think of it, and you started mentioning it. But I like the phrase a lot.
Yeah.
Because,
but does it connect to people who don't understand the word audiation right off the bat, or who know what audiation is and are put off by it? That's another good category of people.
That is mystifying to me, how you can be put off. And so, that's a really important question, what is audiation? And I think that's probably one of the reasons we hit it off so well is because, we both put a lot of thought into what audiation is, specifically what harmonic audiation is. I don't know a lot of people that think about that unless they're composers or really good improvisers. Usually are the only people who want to think about harmonic.
Composers and improvisers and the like seem not to always come from the best music education necessarily, like they went to the blah 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 class, or they just learn it. Let's go another direction. How many different pedagogues have we talked to in the last few months?
Oh yeah, we've talked to a lot, and this is like a perennial audiation problem, and a problem with instruction is that when you design a curriculum, it has to have stair steps. Because if what you do on day 1 doesn't help day 2, day 3, day 4, your curriculum's not building. So it just ends up being like a hodgepodge of disconnected activities. Sure. But I think a true insight that I gained from Gordon is that I'm an instrumental teacher, so everything's being put through that filter for me as a siren, just so everyone knows. But most instrumental methods, as we're all aware of, they're centered more around reading notation and dealing with the difficulties of playing the specific instrument, and not necessarily a correct sequence of audiating things.
Yes.
So, and Gordon even said this in his own work, is that his sequence of how to learn tonality or harmony is not necessarily the only way you could do it. And I've talked about this before, some of my students, they only listen to music that has major and Aeolian. So I teach Aeolian sooner to them if it seems like they can handle it.
Fundamental listening vocabulary. My filter is through early childhood into elementary, and then also teacher education when I'm training other music teachers to understand how I'm teaching these kids to understand tonic dominant, subdominant, double dominant, and major, same thing in minor, 3 functions in the other tonalities. And then by 2nd grade, they're learning all kinds of crazy, 5, 6, 6, 2, 5, 1, 5, 5, 5, 1, 5, 2, 2, 5, 1, all these.
Which for anyone listening, if that went by you pretty fast and didn't make the hair on your arm stand up, it's absurd how effective what Eric is doing actually is, because not many people audiate harmony well. From my experience, in the wild, it's often more of a I don't know how you want to phrase it. It's often more of a miracle or an accident when people do learn how to audiate harmony from traditional methods. And there are good harmonic audiators out there, but if you go to sign up for piano lessons, for example, and you have no idea what how your teacher teaches, you could luck out. Maybe your teacher can audiate harmony really well and can improvise. So you just, hit the jackpot. You tend to learn stuff because they'll expose you to stuff in the lesson that makes the harmony more of an important part of the lesson. But typically that is not done, and it's super rare, actually.
Yeah, or you've got a high enough harmonic aptitude that you just pick stuff off the radio and you know it and you learn it without having need for a specific teacher. You're teaching yourself if you've got that.
Yeah.
We've talked to Bert Ligon. Do you want to say something? And then Hal Galper. He's the one because I saw him play with Phil Woods back in the 70s it might have been 81. It was I think early 80s. And he's playing with Phil Woods, and
that's hardcore bebop. And if people are not listeners of jazz, bebop for me anyway is really a beautiful genre of music. Jazz is not one thing, but for me, bebop is when jazz really harmonically reached a new kind of pinnacle. to play over bebop changes, you're not just going to randomly learn how to do it. It has to be very systematic. You really have to know what you're doing, and you have to absorb the language of jazz as a listening phenomenon. And Hal talks about that. Yeah,
most players, best way to do it is just be the worst person in the band and go learn on the bandstand. Like Charlie Parker got kicked off the bandstand, and Coltrane was terrible for a while, right? But he studied with, he was learning with Benny Golson in the basement when he was a teenager. And then, like if you're learning with those kind of people, you don't have a chance to not come out doing that. And it's not because anybody sequenced anything for them. They're just monsters, and they're gifted, and they worked really hard. It's like the Michael Jordan.
There are certain things though that show up in the bebop tradition. Like when I got really into Joe Pass when I was a teenager, I noticed Joe Pass would always play the same changes, but technically the same changes. C, A minor, D, G. He has a video of this. But almost every time he would play it, he would change the voicing of the function. It was like first time it's, C major 9, second time it's A augmented or something. And so you start learning that the functions can have flavors. And some of the functions can just be straight up substituted for other ones. And that's what I think when there is, a ghost sequence, it's not a textbook that someone followed. But those are the things, if you study on the bandstand and your mentor can see that you don't know the difference between, big 2 and little 2, they'll just keep exposing you to that and hitting you over the head with it until you do know. Yeah. And so there are little nuggets of curriculum sequencing on the street, so to speak.
What Bo and I are really good at, everybody that's listening, is getting into the weeds really quick and then drilling down.
And so what are we doing here? What I want to do, talk about. So we interviewed Hal Galper, right, for an hour, and then we named some others that we did. Bert Ligon, I already mentioned. We reached out to a lot of musicians and authors that I found interesting, that Eric found interesting. Hal Galper is great, he's a monster.
Talk about Bert Ligon for a second.
Bert Ligon, he's professor of jazz at forgive me, I'm forgetting the university, but he has some amazing textbooks, and Bert's a great example.
New England Conservatory?
No, Rand is New England.
Oh, Rand Blake. Rand Blake is the professor of improvisation at New England. Right, I got it mixed up.
Yeah, which was fascinating. New England Conservatory has an improvisation department, so it's not necessarily a jazz department, but it's actually centered around improv, and Ren is a professor emeritus, but he's an amazing musician, and probably one of the most fierce advocates of oral.
Yeah.
He really changed my thinking on a lot of things. But all these musicians, they use the principles of MLT, and so this was an idea that was on my mind, and this is a concept that Eric's brought up so many times in our conversations, the difference between capital MLT and lowercase MLT.
Yeah, that's a good place.
And so it's a really good distinction, because capital MLT is Edwin Gordon / the Gimmel's view of how
Gimmel being Gordon Institute for Music Learning, how you train other teachers to use music learning theory that got developed by Gordon, like the practical application of that. And that it's kind of like the traditional sequencing and how to go about training students in tonal patterns and rhythm patterns, because we understand patterns is the meaning for anything.
And just so it's important for people to know, Eric studied with Dr. Gordon. Eric has really done his time in that world. I actually haven't been trained by the Gimmel. I have the highest respect. I'm a member of Gimmel right now and all that. But I haven't taken these courses. This is just through my own introspection and reading and having conversations with people like Eric, trying to learn as much as I can. But this idea of capital MLT versus lowercase MLT is just what's happening when someone in the wild, I love this term, when someone is not either instructed by someone who knows about Gordon's work or just is naturally learning on their own. Because the principles of Gordon's work, Gordon didn't seek out to make curriculum in the way that a lot of standard music methods are. He wanted you to understand the overarching philosophy and cognitive philosophy around how people really learn music and how they learn to audiate. So if that's the case, then there must be people, like these great musicians like Hal Galper, there must be reasons why he can audiate above his aptitude, or beside his aptitude. Yeah. He obviously has a great aptitude, but there are things he would have done that would have made sense in terms of the learning sequence.
There are common domains for what traditionally is maybe called ear training, and how people learn, and they can come from it at so many different ways, but often it tends to be theoretical before it becomes oral, and there's a back door, and we find people that can do that, and it's like, but no, you can't do that until you have XYZ first. And it's like, well, why do some people come that way? And
I just want to highlight one thing that Eric said. So here, when we're talking about learning, theoretical information before we just learn how to copy a sound, whether it's by rote on an instrument or singing, the theory actually is not. It's not well sequenced when it's the first thing you do, because music is a sensory phenomenon, but it's not the same as sound. And that's like a key insight to have about audiation, is that sound and audiation are separate phenomenon. Audiation is when sound has been organized by the psyche. Sound is just
your mind. Yeah,
not musically organized.
Your mind has to be able to compartmentalize, understand the tonal context, the rhythm context, and then for me, tonal context is completely incomplete. It's 100% incomplete without harmonic.
And then this brings up this other whole avenue that's really interesting, that there are different types of audiation. And Gordon talks about this, and he even says in his work that, it's not just tonal and rhythm. There's a lot of other stuff going on, but it's hard to, tonal and rhythm, they need to be given the status that they are given. But there are other types of audiation, like taste is a type of audiation that people tend to not develop unless they're really steeped in the genre. Yeah.
Well, there's timbral audiation. If you can audiate an orchestration in your mind, there's all kinds of that.
I took a book out when I was in high school from the library. It was called, I believe it was called The Mind's Ear, and it was a very small book, and it had you do exercises for timbral audiation. So it said, imagine a major scale going up and down, played on the piano in the low register. Yeah. Now imagine on the high register. Now imagine a trumpet playing, and it was actually like a systematic training.
Yeah.
And it was cool.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
So who are some of these other guests that we've interviewed already?
Yeah, so we had the really good fortune of getting Paul Harris, who's an amazing English educator. Paul Harris, I always think of Paul Harris, if the Dalai Lama taught music, that's who you would get. He's so intelligent, systematic, but the sweetest guy you'll ever meet. Yeah. And he'd just make you feel good from being around him. And I was so glad to
He was tremendous. He was absolutely tremendous to talk to.
He's really an amazing guy. And he's really one of these. I would consider an anomaly, but he's one of these special cases where Paul uses the most, standard music teaching material you would guess. Like, a lot of it goes against capital MLT, but his students can audiate, and the reason I think that is that Paul really has his priorities set straight. He knows what audiation is, and he's not going to teach someone something when it's out of sequence. He has this natural kind of understanding of skill learning sequence without knowing anything about Gordon, and that's why these conversations are important, because it's easy from a capital MLT or from a GIML perspective to write off what Paul's doing. But I think we have to be more nuanced in our conversations and than that. But
definitely, because listen, I could pick apart like things from my perspective that I don't necessarily like about what Paul's doing, right?
For sure.
But you can't deny how effective and how great it's been. So there's like places where, he and I could get into a rich disagreement or discussion or like that. You and I have had a couple, 3 contentious moments where it's like, all right, we're not going to talk about that ever again because I'm just out the door when you go that deep, or that far. So anyway, I just want to like put this in the context of what the podcast is exploration of all these ideas, and make up your own mind, but do some due diligence. Maybe listen to a few episodes before you decide Bo and I are actually.
Well, and part of what interests me, I see three. I see 3 pillars or 3 filters this has to be put through when we're talking to musicians about how to learn music. One is just the straight up research that Gordon did, because as Eric's presented to me, it's hard to properly understand how much time and energy and how much time and energy with amazing research that Dr. Gordon actually did, and he's got absurd amounts of space dedicated in. What's the library that has all this material? So
the Gordon Library at the University of South Carolina has 200 linear feet in the library of his. Now, some of it's his tests, some of it's his books, some of it's his monographs, some of it's, other things. But think about 200 feet walking down a library aisle.
And so one of the reasons that I think it's important to give. So I was going to talk about 3 pillars of having these conversations. Gordon's pillar is important not just because we love him, but because he was the first person to really operationalize and define this word audiation in a precise way. Because a lot of other musicians talk about this inner hearing, hearing. Like there's all these other words, but Gordon had this more precise definition. So, and as a researcher, he was actually trying to figure out what moved the needle on this precise definition. Yeah. So his research is different for me than a lot of just other research, because other research could be doing research on audiation, but more likely not if the person doing the research doesn't fully understand what audiation even is.
Yeah, he brought a distinction. So he brought audiation and distinguished it from basically the ether, or the ether being the results of the musical aptitude profile, which was his, first real gargantuan publication in the 60s, and he was trying to understand why the test was working the way it was in terms of. And then he did 5, 7, and 9 years down the road from giving the test, he would have people play, and the test predicted how they would play, like how rhythmically accurate they were, how in tune they were, how much they understood harmony, how much they could improvise, what their choices were when they were asked to finish a phrase. It's like the test predicted, so much of someone's achievement 5, 7, 9 years down the road. It's insane. Now, there's a whole lot more bigger piece than the test predicts, but without that information. So why does the test work in that way? It's like, well, you're holding something in your mind and you're listening to something else. And then you make that comparison. And it's like, well, what is that process? And he didn't
that's something we have to get into, because
that's what audiation was born from trying to understand why the test was working that way. People are anti-test, but this thing is just a valuable piece of research.
I'm very pro-test. Test. I mean, what all a test reveals is how well. All a test really reveals is how well the current training has affected the student. So if you're going to talk about audiation, if there's 0 to 5, and now you give them an audiation test, there is obviously a genetic component, but a lot of what you're going to be testing is how much music were they exposed to and how much is music part of their life. There is going to be a genetic component, for sure. But
we get deeper into the difference between achievement and aptitude measures and how they work.
But this other pillar that I wanted to talk about, which is important, so the first two are Gordon's research and then other research. But I'm going to put Gordon's pillar as its own pillar. But the other pillar that came up for me is that because Gordon researched things from the bottom up, so he was really trying to figure out, like, how do you make kids audiate better? You know, how do you actually do this in sequence? Which is amazing. But there's this other side, because there's this other side of what happens, you know, as the phrase, in the wild. Because we have these crazy harmonic jazz improv, bebop people. We have all these, you know, we have classical professors who can improvise Baroque counterpoint, and they know what it's going to sound like before they play over the changes. This is a very high level of audiation, and it would have been difficult for Gordon to run research in the same way. So we actually have to take more of a data collection perspective and look at, okay, well, we have these great harmonic audiators, and clearly at this point their aptitudes are probably all through the roof. Sure, great. But what are they all doing that links up? And a lot of it lines up with the skill learning.
We're trying to overlap other people's perspectives on what we're bringing to the party, which is this thing that's common is audiation among all of them.
Yeah, and there's certain things like for example, Gordon didn't have the privilege of doing, you know, I'm a guitarist, so for me it's like I want to know how people develop kinesthetic and like visual audiation that goes with their guitar. And you know, Gordon says, you know, he doesn't have time to teach kinesthetic audiation, but for me there's clearly a sequence of learning kinesthetic audiation on the guitar, and there are guitarists that seem to have methods that produce those results better and worse than others. So that, because we haven't done research on that, we kind of have to look to the wild and see what's working and what's not working. But I think both these perspectives kind of put together, it makes a very kind of holistic and nuanced view of how people learn music.
Yeah, totally.
So that's what we're kind of into. We're kind of just going to explore. Eric and I are probably going to explore some of these topics one-on-one, because we both spent so much time thinking about it, and we love talking to it with each other. And then also just, you know, reach out to the rest of the music world, people we're interested in, people we respect.
Yeah, we had a conversation with Andy Mullen, who's from the Gordon Institute of Music Learning teaching faculty. A good friend of mine who's a killer jazz pianist. He talked about technique and that kind of thing. We already talked about Rand Blake, whose department.
And Andy was actually a great conversation, because if you guys don't know Andy Mullen, Andy has a really good online set of resources for people interested in you know, classic MLT. Like Andy, for a while, I was sending my students his tonal patterns that are on his YouTube channels. So he's got tonal patterns. He's got a lot of the materials needed, and so it's he's a great guy, and he was one of the people that I was badgering when I was first starting to read about Gordon. I was sending him huge emails.
Yeah, the other thing that gets sprinkled in all the way through these conversations is your heavy load of understanding of learning theory, not music learning theory, or cognitive load theory, or acceptance and commitment theory. Just you.
Yeah, so you're
well-read. You're a well-read dude, man.
I'm a well-read person, no university background, but I read a lot. But there are a lot of other learning theories that if you put them with MLT, whether, you know, whatever MLT you want, it actually can change the way you look at MLT. And for me, it showed what Gordon was doing made even more sense, because
Well, he didn't get all of it from nowhere. Gagne was a learning theorist that he borrowed a lot from and 100 others.
Well, I mean, that's a sign of someone actually doing something. It's quite rare that people come up with ideas out of nowhere. It's more likely that even when there are quantum jumps, that people are well read and then they absorb it and they make a connection that no one's made before. Yeah, but for Gordon, I think the concept of audiation, that's a bigger philosophical insight that's been applied to music. Like this concept that our mind creates abstraction.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we'll get into that because I think understanding what audiation is really important for teachers and students. And I don't even know what could be more important.
Yeah.
because if you're a teacher and you're guiding a student, you can tell if they're audiating something if they play it or not. Once you understand what audiation is, there's this directness to how they play, and there are little things you can do, little quizzes in certain ways where you can weed out whether they're audiating what you're playing or not, even if they can't label it what it is.
Yeah. So you and I get into the weeds. We also kind of put out some fertilizer. We do all kinds of stuff. Fertilizer both can be taken two ways. We have these really rich conversations over time. You and I have recorded maybe 6 or 10 hours. I don't know ourselves. Not all of it's going to make the air. But we also have, 5 or 6 other guests that are on our list that look to me like, wow, Suzuki, somebody who's trained in Suzuki, but loves improvisation. Like,
oh, for sure.
What is she doing? That's crazy. Yeah. I want to talk. I can't wait to have that conversation. But over the months and years, hopefully we're still doing this.
And I would really encourage anyone who's, listening to this or interested in listening to the other episodes of the podcast, if there are things that we talk about that confuse you, reach out to us because we would like to start doing like FAQ sessions where if there's some part of MLT that you don't understand, or if there's something about what we're saying that you don't understand, reach out and let us know because we would love to dedicate time to actually unpacking that and helping people get involved in the conversation.
Yeah. I think we've missed maybe 2 weeks in how many months? 6 months? How long have we been having these conversations?
Yeah, it's been a while. It's been very nice, actually. I didn't realize, being a music teacher is an interesting job because often we work alone. And, just like other kinds of teachers. And having these professional conversations, whether it's, listening to a podcast or literally having a conversation with another musician, it's really important because if you, let's say, for example, you're a different profession like a doctor or an architect or whatever it is, it's very likely you will be forced to have a dialogue with colleagues at some level, whether you're working directly with them. But for music teachers, we can often go long stretches of time without talking to anyone about just how this stuff works and what's on our mind. And that's what I think the role of these conversations has been for Eric and I, is that the stuff that you're thinking about, and it's just nice to chat with other people about it and see what they think and where they are with it.
Yeah. So reach out. We'll have an email at some point. For now, I'm happy to take those emails. teachmusictokids@gmail.com. Spell it all out. teachmusictokids@gmail. And maybe we'll have a session where we'll have live people ask questions. So we can include you in on the podcast. Let's have a conversation about how you're thinking about what we're thinking about.
Yeah. I think that sounds great. And it really makes, if you're a music teacher specifically, once these ideas really are in your mind, teaching totally changes. You become very interested in, especially people that learn very slowly, because you could call them low performers, which is a term I figure not a lot of people will enjoy, but it is the term for it.
That's me.
But what happens is if you have a student that struggles, they're showing you full blown where your shortcomings as a teacher are, where your curriculum doesn't make sense because they are low performers. So if you can help these students that seem to just struggle with music forever, your job totally changes. You start enjoying all those little challenges because they're just showing you things that you're doing that don't make sense, that aren't helping. And once you kind of start weeding that out in your teaching, it just becomes a breeze to teach. You start enjoying the process because you really feel like you can help people learn.
As terrible it was the start of this school year was for me, with enrollment down like 80% again. It's like, oh my God. So, but I'm desperate for something to hang on to. And then finally, teaching schedule comes and here it is, 9 o'clock, let's teach. And then, oh my God, I taught a lesson like I never taught before in my life. And I felt like at the end of it, it's like, thank God that I had, whatever I had to fall on, because I was, looking into dark places, given the enrollment and like that. But gosh, like meeting 6 new kids or 8 new kids in a class and then going on to the next. And it's like in dancing with what they're providing me and showing me they're ready for and what they're ready to do. Oh, boy, I just eat that up. Because if you can't improvise and create, it's not, to me, teaching is nothing like, okay, now we're going to learn blah, blah, blah today. And here's my lesson plan. I'm going to follow it, blah, blah, blah. And you go through that and the kids are supposed to know blah, blah, blah. And the next time you talk to them, do they remember the blah, blah, blah you taught them? And it's like, well, I don't know, because we're meeting them where they were at the beginning.
That's such a good, one thing that Hal Galper talks about is paying attention as a musician, paying attention to what interests you. Because if you listen to music and that music interests you, it's a sign that you're probably audiating it. He doesn't say it in that term, but that's what I think about it. It's a sign that there's something there that you're interested in. So like what I do, I teach one-on-one. So I think if you're teaching a group, you have to have a bit more of a game plan because it could get off the rails really fast. But generally, when I'm teaching one-on-one, I just ask students, what do you want to learn? What are you actually listening to? And so, my lessons will just turn into we're learning just whatever song they want. I'll teach them as much of it that they're ready for. I'll extract whatever tonal patterns or rhythm patterns I can, and it works beautifully.
Yeah, a lot of our conversations cover a lot what we're dabbling in now.
For sure.
We'll get deep into all of these things.
But I had stuff like this happens in lessons. It makes you so glad to be a teacher. I have this student who I've taught for 2 years. Yesterday in the lesson, she was like near the end of the lesson. I went to her house and rang the doorbell, and it made dun dun dun. So at the end of the lesson, I was like, "Hey, this is your doorbell ringtone." and then my phone went off and made an alarm tone that was a little bit different. And then I played the alarm tone. I figured it out. But this is where it was fun. She was like, "How do you know how to play something on the piano from just listening to it once? How is that possible?" And it was the first time she ever asked me that. Like, she was serious. Like, she wanted to answer that question. And I was like, isn't that interesting? Isn't that an interesting question? How does that happen? And, I couldn't give her much to go on, but I was like, it kind of sounds like this other song. Your doorbell sounds like "Oh Canada." Dun, dun, dun.
You need to have experience either with that pattern or a pattern that's similar to it and a pattern that's different from it. And then once you can learn the sameness and the difference, or the sameness and the not sameness, boy, you can hear stuff. And
but it was just such a fun moment because I was just
a perfect question.
It felt very nice. I was like, she really is coming to grips with the fact that she can't do this yet, but she can kind of do it.
He was asking you, how do I audiate?
Yeah.
How do I learn to audiate? She's asking you that flat out.
Yeah, which is funny because the first year or so of lessons, she would pick up stuff by rote on the piano. She's doing great. Second year, her ear is just so big now. Yeah. It's like she can. It's wild. And now that question really, she wants to know.
That's perfect.
So that's a bit of a ramble about what we're up to and what's in store on the podcast. But yeah, please reach out to us and let us know what you're interested in. If you have a musician or or someone you think would be interesting for us to interview, let us know. We'd love to reach out to more people.
Absolutely. This has been a fun conversation over many months, and it's always a fun conversation with a rare exception each time we talk.
Once in a while I make Eric question his life's work, and there's a bit of friction there. So
But we think this is healthy. This is the thing, because it's healthy. We all have boundaries for different things. It's so healthy, and we want to. I think that there's not enough healthy dialogue that happens, not within tribe members, and even within the Gimel tribe. I think there's some need for some clarifications on some things, and expectations and evolutions of music learning theory that can be considered. And I think those kind of dialogues should be professional and great. But there's also, among tribes, so among the Suzuki or the Orif or the Kodai, like, what are we really getting at? And hopefully,
Well, I really like that. Suzuki is a very interesting whole area that I would love to get into, because I think there's a lot of really good things going on there, and there's a reason that these kids are instrumentally audiating so well, and I'd love to get into that.
Yeah, many of them.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you for being with us, and I hope you connect and let us know what you're thinking, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Thanks for coming. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much.